My husband said the twins weren't his. Then he looked me in the eyes and asked for a divorce. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just folded the paper and said, "Noted." He thought I was done. He thought I was defeated. He had no idea who I really was. Where are you listening from? Subscribe to EN True Tales. This one's going to hit hard. My name is Marina Hallberg. I'm 38. And for a long time, I let the world believe I was ordinary. Just another wife. Just another woman who gave up her career to raise children. Just another name under his. But before the betrayal, before the twins, the whispers, the papers shoved across the table, I was someone else. I used to live in Oslo. I spoke 3 languages, wore tailored suits, and signed contracts that decided the future of entire pharmaceutical markets. Back then, I wasn't Mrs. Hallberg. I was Marina Solvi, Chief Financial Officer at Norvara Biohealth. I met Nolan at a medical ethics conference in Copenhagen. He was speaking on neurosurgical funding. I was one of the keynote panelists. We argued about insurance reform over bitter espresso. He made me laugh. It was the kind of meeting you think will never lead anywhere. But 2 months later, he was in Minnesota and asking if I believed in long distance. I didn't, but I believed in his eyes. When we married, he insisted we settle in Charleston, his family's city, his family's legacy. The Hallbergs had lived there for generations, and that mattered more to them than I understood at the time. We moved into the old family estate, a sprawling mansion of stone and silence, sitting just off the Ashley River. Astrid Hallberg, his mother, lived 10 minutes away, and somehow always closer than that. At first, I tried. I hosted tea on Thursdays. I complimented her collection of Scandinavian tapestries. I even listened politely when she told me that women of my generation lacked grace. She hated that I kept my last name on paper. She hated that I didn't ask her before hanging our wedding photos. She hated more than anything that Nolan looked at me like I was his equal. So I did what women are taught to do. I tried harder. I stepped back from my position at Norvara after the first year. Then I stepped away completely. I told Nolan it was temporary. He said, "Take your time." But time passed. I volunteered. I managed the house. I supported his career at the hospital. I smiled through brunches with his board members' wives and let Astrid cut into conversations like she owned the room, because she did. Every holiday, she'd find a way to ask, "So, still not working?" And I'd smile, because I thought that was strength. Then the miracle happened. After years of failed attempts, the fertility treatments worked. Not one heartbeat too. Twins, Leaf and Alara. Nolan cried when we saw the ultrasound. Astrid did not. She raised an eyebrow and said, "Interesting timing." I pretended not to hear, because I wanted peace, because I was tired, because I was scared that speaking up would make Nolan choose, and I already knew who he'd choose. Still, I held on. I carried them for 32 weeks. We spent days in the NICU, me beside them, him between surgeries. Astrid never once stepped foot in that hospital room. And when we finally brought the twins home, she came over, held Leaf for less than a minute, looked me in the eyes, and said, "They don't look like Nolan." I didn't answer, but something in me, something I hadn't felt in years, stirred. Not rage, not fear, memory. The woman I used to be, she wouldn't have let that slide. The woman I used to be didn't explain herself to people who didn't earn it. And maybe she wasn't gone. Maybe she was just sleeping, and maybe she was waking up. The envelope wasn't even sealed. It was left open on the marble kitchen counter right next to the bottle warmer and the pacifier Ilara had dropped that morning. I picked it up slowly. The handwriting on the front was mine. He had written it on the envelope, used one of my note cards, my pen. Inside, divorce papers. No discussion, no warning, just the packet, and one yellow post-it on top. Let's not make this messier than it has to be. Nolan, the breath caught in my chest. Not rage, not heartbreak. Something colder. There were terms. Of course there were. He offered to cover reasonable living costs. He requested joint custody pending verification of paternity. And at the bottom in fine print, a clause that stripped me of any claim to the Hallberg estate in light of unresolved biological discrepancies. I turned the last page and saw the attached lab request, a paternity test. For Leif, for Alara, signed off by Astrid Hallberg. It was dated the day after the twins came home. So this wasn't impulsive, it wasn't grief, it wasn't stress. It was a plan. I stood in that quiet kitchen with Alara's lullaby still playing softly in the background and Nolan's signature staring up at me. I didn't cry, I didn't call him, I didn't even sit down. I just placed the packet back on the counter, walked into the nursery, and stared at my children. Their cheeks were pink, their lashes long and curled like mine. Alara's fingers always curled into tiny fists. Leif liked the warmth of my collarbone when he slept. They were mine entirely, undeniably, but that wasn't the point. The point was Nolan had chosen to doubt. And worse, he had chosen to write me off before I ever had a chance to speak. He didn't ask, he didn't wonder. He let his mother whisper poison and then signed it with a smile. I walked back to the kitchen, stared at that yellow post-it one more time. Let's not make this messier than it has to be. I smiled, not because I agreed, but because I knew something he didn't. He thought he was erasing me. He had no idea. I had already started writing the next chapter. That night I didn't sleep, but not because of grief. I stayed up, organizing. I folded baby clothes by size, sorted medical receipts by date, opened my old laptop, the one Nolan thought I'd retired years ago. I logged into Norvara's investor portal. The two-factor authentication still worked. My name was still there, so was my 11% equity stake. I clicked through those holdings past the quarterly reports, past the charitable grants, until I found it. Line item number 93, Charleston General Research Fund, primary benefactor Norvara BioHealth. I stared at that line for a long time. Then I opened a blank document and typed one sentence. Kain, when you fund a man's reputation, you also have the power to undo it. I closed the file, saved it under a simple name, hallbergplan.docx. The next morning, Nolan kissed the twins, or at least pretended to. He didn't look me in the eye, didn't ask if I slept, didn't notice I had reinstalled the old espresso machine in the corner. Going somewhere, I asked gently. Work, he said flat, like I didn't know where he disappeared every day at 7:10. I'll drop by the hospital later, I added. Leif needs a new pediatric referral. He paused, half a second too long. Then that's not necessary, I'll handle it. I nodded, but I didn't sit down. I didn't make breakfast, didn't scroll aimlessly on my phone, didn't waste the hours crying on the couch. Instead, I emailed Norvara's board secretary, requested a private investor session off record. Subject line, internal conflict. Strategic realignment. No one blinked when the request came from me. No one questioned Marina Solvi. By noon, I'd already gathered the original ownership documents of my shares. By 2 p.m., I had printed every tax form letter and contract that tied me to the fund that had kept Charleston General afloat for 5 years. By 4 p.m., I had compiled a press folder unsigned ready if needed. No threats, no legal jargon, just truth, and timeline, and receipts. Nolan came home at 6:48. He barely noticed the espresso machine was gone again. Didn't ask why I was dressed. Going out, he asked. Just clearing my head, I replied. He nodded, like that meant nothing. He thought I was grieving. He thought I was preparing to disappear. But what I was really doing was preparing to be seen, for the first time in years on my own terms. I took the long way to the Norvara office, not because I didn't know the way I designed the route 5 years ago, but because I wanted the silence before the move. Downtown Charleston was waking up, its oak trees swaying gently. In the salt-heavy air, its historic buildings casting soft shadows across cobblestone. It looked like nothing had changed. And maybe to them, nothing had. But I wasn't here for them. The receptionist looked up confused. Then recognition flickered behind her eyes. "Miss Solvey," she whispered. I nodded once. "I'll let the boardroom know." I waited by the glass sculpture in the foyer. They hadn't changed it. I commissioned it 6 years ago. I stepped into the room. No introductions were needed, not for me. The head of investor relations stood. "Marina," he said, "we weren't expecting." I know I cut in calmly, but I believe the current situation calls for quiet alignment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I simply laid the file folder on the table. Inside, a breakdown of Halberg Neuroscience Center's reliance on Norvara funding, public grant records, PR contracts that position Nolan as a leading medical voice, and a list of upcoming events, gala keynote press tours featuring his name, all funded by me. The board members leaned in. I didn't gloat. I didn't threaten. I just turned the final page and let them see the signature block. Marina Solvey Halberg, major shareholder, Norvara BioHealth founding chair, Ethical Oversight Initiative. Someone cleared their throat. "Are you requesting we pull out?" "No," I said. "Not yet." They waited. I let the silence linger. "Then I'm requesting a temporary hold on all public-facing collaborations tied to the Halberg name until internal matters are clarified." The legal advisor leaned forward. "This includes the gala keynote." "Yes, and the research grant renewal." For now, someone shifted in their chair, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement. They had forgotten who I was, but I hadn't. One man asked cautiously, "Will this become visible?" I paused, then answered honestly, "Only if they force me to make it so." They nodded, one by one, silently. I stood up, thanked them, and left the room. Outside, the breeze had picked up. The clouds were heavier, the day darker. But I wasn't worried. For the first time in months, I was walking out of a room with my name still intact. Not the wife, not the mother, not the accused. Just Marina. And that was more than enough. It came in just after midnight. A chime, soft, unassuming. I was in the nursery rocking Leaf back to sleep when my phone lit up. A voice message from Astrid Halberg. I stared at the screen, no text, just a 42-second audio clip. She had never messaged me directly, not once, not in all the years we'd known each other, but here it was. I tapped play, and what I heard wasn't meant for me. "And she'll sign, trust me. She's not built for war. She's tired, alone. It's only a matter of time." There was a pause, then a sip. I could hear the faint clink of a glass against her rings. "That Nolan just needs to hold the line. Once the DNA paperwork settles, we'll move her out of the house. Quietly, gracefully. She'll want to avoid scandal." My hand didn't shake, not even then. Because nothing in that message surprised me. Not really. But hearing it, hearing her confidence, her calculation made it real. She didn't just doubt me, she had orchestrated the doubt. She had planned the exit, pre-written the narrative, filed me under replaceable. And the worst part, she thought I didn't know how this worked. Thought I'd never played this game before. She forgot who I used to be, who I still was. I replayed the voice note once, only once. Then I saved it, labeled it Inheritance Strategy.m4a. That morning I made no mention of it. Didn't bring it up at breakfast, didn't text Nolan, didn't reply to Astrid. I let her believe it went unheard, unnoticed, because the best way to disarm a manipulator is to let them keep speaking until their own words bury them. At noon, I uploaded the audio to a private cloud archive. created 3 duplicates, one saved to my locked drive, one emailed to myself, and one embedded in a private URL with timed access. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was ready. I looked at the twins that afternoon. They were sleeping side by side, Alara curled toward her brother like a shield. And I thought, they will grow up never having to prove their bloodline to anyone, because I will never let anyone question their worth again. Not with silence, not with suggestion, not with schemes whispered into bourbon glasses by women who mistake cruelty for legacy. That night, I opened a clean page in my notebook. And at the top, I wrote, Final stage, controlled disclosure. Timeline 5 days format. Public inevitable irrevocable. Then I underlined it once, firm, steady, because I didn't want revenge. I wanted removal. Erasure of doubt, total and final. They had their turn. Now it was mine. The folder was red, intentionally. Bright enough to draw the eye, cold enough to signal blood without saying a word. I carried it in my left hand as I stepped into the boardroom of Charleston General. The same room where Nolan had once delivered lectures on neuroethics, where Astrid had once posed for press photos next to donor plaques she never paid for. Today there were 10 people seated. 8 from the hospital's executive team, 2 from Norvara's foundation committee, and 1 empty chair mine. Until now, I didn't sit. I didn't take off my coat. I didn't look at Nolan, though he sat 2 seats down, flipping his pen like it might explain the tremor in his hand. I placed the folder on the center of the table, unclipped the top, and began. This meeting is recorded, I said. Let the record show that this is a courtesy briefing, not a negotiation. The room stilled. I handed copies of the printed document to each attendee. Not too many pages, just enough. Inside, a formal notice of Norvara's temporary withdrawal of sponsorship, a clause citing reputational risk tied to ongoing internal family disputes, a time-stamped transcript of Astrid's voice message, a highlighted record of the Hallberg family's past use of hospital authority for personal leverage in board elections. Someone cleared their throat. But I didn't pause. This action is not permanent, but it is necessary. I turned finally and looked at Nolan. He was pale, still, exposed. I won't speak further on the personal details, I said, my voice flat. But I will not allow Norvara's name or mine to be used to prop up a legacy built on lies. One of the executives leaned forward. Marina, are you certain this is how you want to proceed? I nodded once. Very. The folder clicked shut. The meeting adjourned without a single vote. As I stepped out, Nolan followed me into the hallway. Marina, wait. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. He said nothing. Just stood there waiting for me to speak first, but I didn't. Because men like Nolan don't understand silence until it swallows them whole, and by then it's already too late. The story made the papers, not because I wanted it to, but because some stories refuse to stay quiet. Prominent surgeon withdrawn from hospital honor gala. Amid sponsorship scandal. That was the headline. Nolan's name buried in the 4th paragraph. My name not mentioned at all, just the way I preferred it. By the end of the week, Norvara had pulled 2 of their PR partnerships. Astrid Hallberg quietly stepped down from the hospital's historical preservation board. And Nolan? Well, Nolan took an indefinite leave. I didn't call him. He didn't show up at the house again. No custody papers, no follow-up on the divorce. It was as if he had dissolved into the silence he once forced on me. I wasn't angry, not anymore. Because anger is a tether, and I had cut mine clean. I had the twins, and I had my name. I filed for formal restoration of identity. Marina Solvi, not Hallberg. The clerk asked me if I wanted to explain. I told her no. She smiled. I moved out of the estate 2 weeks later. Not because I had to, it was still under Nolan's name, and legally he hadn't filed anything official. but because I wanted no ghosts in the wallpaper. The new place was smaller, modern, bright. The twins had matching cribs by the window. I hung their birth certificates above the changing table next to the ultrasound photos Nolan never framed. Every morning I made my own coffee, no machine, just a quiet kettle and a teaspoon of control. I began consulting again, quietly, under my real name. People remembered. They always do when you stop asking them to. One day, Alara giggled so hard at a blanket that she toppled sideways. Leaf clapped for the first time, and I found myself crying not because I was broken, but because I was finally whole. No press conference, no speech, no applause. Just me, the babies, and a world that no longer needed my silence to survive. I didn't win. I rebuilt, and that's harder. But better, he showed up at the cafe. Uninvited, unannounced, like regret often does. I was stirring cream into my coffee. Leif was asleep in the stroller. Ilara babbled to herself, content with a piece of bread. Marina, he said like a man who hadn't once erased me. I didn't flinch, didn't smile, just looked up and said, "You have 5 minutes." He sat across from me. Same coat, same eyes, but they didn't look at me the same way anymore. "I was wrong," he said. I let the words hang, waited. I let her get into my head. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting my name, our family. Our family, I cut in, gently but sharp. He exhaled, tired, guilty. "I didn't know who you really were," he admitted. And that was the thing, wasn't it? He never asked. He never looked. He just assumed I was convenient, replaceable, contained. "I'm not angry anymore," I told him. He looked up, hopeful, foolish. "But I'm also not yours." He swallowed, hard. "Do you think, someday, they'll forgive me?" He gestured to the twins. I didn't answer right away, because the truth is, I didn't know. "They'll know who showed up and who didn't," I said simply. He nodded, as if that was all he came for. I stood up, reached for the stroller, gathered Alara's blanket. "Goodbye, Nolan." His voice cracked slightly. "Will I see you again?" I met his eyes one last time. "No." I turned, walked out. The bell above the cafe door chimed behind me. The air outside was crisp, the sky wide open. Leaf stirred softly. Alara reached for my finger. I held her hand, and for the first time in years, I knew. This was the last page, the last line, and it belonged to me. The headlines faded. So did he. Charleston forgot Nolan Halberg faster than I expected. Another surgeon filled the press slot. Another donor stepped into Astrid's place. Another polished family photo replaced ours on the hospital gala invites. But I didn't disappear. I just chose to exist somewhere else. Quieter, wider, mine. I registered a new name for consulting. Solvi Strategy. Small, discreet, invitation only. I never listed my full resume, never advertised. Didn't need to. People who needed me found me. Because word travels fast in circles where truth is currency, especially when it's whispered through closed doors. I spoke once on record. A podcast for women in leadership. I didn't mention Nolan, didn't say divorce or betrayal. I just said some lessons come wrapped in silk. Others come in litigation paper. They laughed, I smiled, and that was enough. The twins grew quickly. Ilara liked string lights and tearing paper. Leaf liked birds, particularly the ones that swooped too low over the riverbank. I took them walking every morning past the wrought iron gates and cobbled paths Nolan once called tradition. He sent a birthday card once, no return address, just 2 names in shaky cursive, Dad and Grandma. I didn't show it to them, not yet, not out of spite, but because stories need time to finish themselves before the next chapter begins. And this one, the story, was mine now. I kept one thing from the old house, a chess piece, the queen, not because I needed the metaphor, but because it fit perfectly in the palm of my hand. Weighted, stable. I hold it sometimes when the silence feels too loud, when the past knocks gently disguised as memory, but I never open the door. Because healing isn't about forgetting, it's about remembering clearly what you'll never allow again. So if you ask me what happened to the man who doubted me or the woman who tried to unmake me, I'll say nothing. Because nothing is exactly what they became, and I became everything they didn't see coming.